Download the free Book Lovers Trail Te Arakai Puka Puka audio app and start your literary journey along State Highway 2, from Wellington through the Wairarapa and into the Hawke's Bay, one bookshop at a time. Download the app now from the Apple Store, Google Play Store or the web app. More info at www.booktown.org.nz.
Thank you, and hopefully you can all hear me. Welcome. It's great to see such a big crowd, and I suspect most of you have, looking at some of the faces in the crowd, have some pretty good firm views on this issue. So at the end, we will be opening it up to questions, and I'm sure there'll be heaps of them. First of all, though, let's just quickly, Rogernomics, I think, is the name that the name that has come to be associated with economic reforms in the 1980s. It's one of the most profound periods in our economic and social history, and one with lasting impacts, and though they were subject to considerable debate, and we are still debating them today 40 years later. 1984, that was the year I started in journalism. I was a long way removed. I was at the Hamilton Press, which was a tiny newspaper, so not quite in the thick of it. But it was something that consumed the whole country, as we all know. The story of Rogernomics is carved deep in our political history. It was preceded by a constitutional and economic crisis, and that was the backdrop for much of what followed. We saw the economy opened up, massive changes, GST introduced, forests sold, state-owned enterprises corporatised. The name of the game was speed. Rogernomics was about opening up the economy at pace. But there's no doubt that the pain of such rapid and dramatic change was felt across the board, both in farming communities and manufacturing and forestry. We have here some people today, Liz Mellish and Bob Francis, both can talk about the impact on their community. Featherston, which was one of those small communities that did feel it deeply. And then welcome, thank you for sharing your experiences with us today. And from the other side of the fence, we have politicians Marilyn and Rick Barker, and of course, last but never least, Richard Prebble, whose name and face are in many ways most associated with Rogernomics, even though its name is drawn from its architect, Sir Roger Douglas. Welcome, and a huge thanks to the three of you for sharing. Richard Prebble, you have written a few books about that period, the most famous being I've Been Thinking. 40 years later, are you still thinking about that time? And if you were a student of history, how would you judge it? He's going to stand.
40 years ago, I'm actually still extremely proud of what we did. I read the briefing note for this occasion, and frankly, it's wrong. It says the Wairarapa suffered the most, and probably all here of real suffering. But the Wairarapa actually was one of the areas that benefited the most from Rogernomics. And you can't actually think about the area at the time without realising the reason. In July 1984, New Zealand was a failed state. I can remember 2 days after the election going with David Longy, Roger Douglas, Jeffrey Palmer and David Cagle to meet the Treasury and the Reserve Bank. And the first question we asked is, well, why are all foreign exchange dealings suspended? You couldn't change a New Zealand dollar for an overseas currency. And the answer was, because we've run out of overseas exchange. So, well, why don't you use your emergency lines of credit? They're exhausted. Why don't you borrow some more? If the market knew where we were borrowing from, our reputation would take a hiding. Took a few seconds, then asked, when's the next overseas loan due? Next Wednesday, Minister. We hadn't actually been called in, but they called us ministers. Can you pay? No. If we default, there's a clause that says we default on every single loan we have, and it will be impossible to trade with the rest of the world. What are our options? Well, you've got two, ministers. You can call them the IMF. They'll give us an emergency loan, but they will take control of the budget until they think the finances of New Zealand are right. Well, we had fought hard to become the government, only to hand over to some bureaucrats in Washington. What's the other alternative? The Reserve Bank said it's our view that a devaluation of 20% is required to restore confidence in the dollar. That decision didn't take long because we actually knew, like most of the rest of the world, that the New Zealand dollar was overvalued. That did hit people in the cities hard because all imports went up. But if you were an exporter, and this is an export region, your income went up 20% immediately. But here's a different story which might help you understand Rogernomics and the speed. Got elected in July. Well, my kids were at school, so the family stayed up in Auckland, and I was in Wellington. And at Christmas, they asked for a duty solicitor, duty minister. Some minister has to stay in Wellington, while all the others, like the rest of the government, go on holiday. And I, like a mug, volunteered. Because I thought this is an opportunity to bring the kids down to Wellington, they can see where Dad works. And so I was made the duty minister. And the last Wellington minister went, I think, on holiday from memory on the 23rd of December. And at 10 a.m. I became the minister in charge of about 80 portfolios. 1 minute past 10, the phone rang, and it was the Treasury. And they said, "We've got a situation, Minister. It's urgent. We'd rather not come into the office and alert the market that there's a situation. Can you come over to the Treasury?" So, just across the road. Went across the road. What's the situation? No freezing works has been able to open this year. Now, why? All the cool stores are full of last year's meat that the meat board hasn't been able to sell. We had a situation where the sheep farm, which is big in this area, be facing problems. The Muldoon solution was to give them a subsidy. The subsidy, the sheep retention scheme, in some ways was a brilliant success. The farmers found 10 million sheep that we didn't know about. The difficulty was it didn't actually create a new market. But the Treasury then said to me, the meat board has been speaking to the Ayatollahs in Iran, who are conducting a war with Iraq, and they'd like to buy all our last year's meat. The problem is they've got no money. They like to swap it for oil. The problem is that Marsden Point can't handle Iranian oil, but the Japanese have agreed to take the oil and to pay us. And the first ship to take the meat has arrived, but the problem is that the Iranians and the Japanese don't trust each other, and they have said that they won't do the deal unless they have a government guarantee. So I said, yeah, well, how much is the government guarantee going to be for? And in today's dollars, around about $2.4 billion. So what's the procedure for a government guarantee when the Cabinet's not meeting? Well, you'll need to sign it as acting minister. Then we need the finance minister and the prime minister. I had to think about that. If that deal went south, you'd never be able to explain why you gave a $2.4 billion guarantee. You'd have to resign. We couldn't afford to have the Prime Minister resign. We couldn't afford to have the Finance Minister resign. But if I resigned, it might actually improve the government's popularity. So I said, give me the guarantee. And I signed as Richard Prebble, acting Minister for everything. I signed as the acting Finance Minister, and I signed as the acting Prime Minister, and I went on holiday. I confess that for 3 months I sweated about whether the deal would happen. And when the other ministers came back, I said, I'm never doing this again. We've got to tell the meat board we're not going to give guarantees like that. Went to see the meat board, and they said, understand, But you should understand, Minister, that farming in New Zealand is no longer profitable because the cost of the railways, the cost of our ports, the cost of the freezing works have made us uncompetitive. And we said, and I don't think they believed us, we understand that, and we understand that it has to be reformed urgently. And that's what we did. So when I became Minister of Railways, there were 24,000 railway workers. Freight rates were exorbitant. Freight was lost, sometimes whole train loads. I'm not sure if this was the Wairarapa, but I got a phone call one day from people complaining there was a terrible smell coming up from the railway line. They'd rung the railways, couldn't find anyone. I sent someone up there, and there was a whole trainload of refrigerated wagons, only the refrigeration was off, and so was the meat inside. A whole trainload. But after 3 years of reform, there were just 6,000 railway workers. They were carrying 4 times more freight at half the price, and instead of losing $1 million a day, they were making $2.5 million. Well, an area like this is dependent on transport. When I came to the ports, I got a report saying that the most efficient New Zealand port was less efficient than the most inefficient Australian port. The Australian minister came and visited me, told me that port reform was his #1 priority. He'd done a report on how to do it. I asked him for a copy. He went home. I said to my officials, we're going to reform our ports before the Aussies do, and I've got their report. And when we finished after 2 years, we had the most efficient ports in Australia, and in fact, we were nearly at Singapore.
I'm going to ask...
One more second. So Wairarapa benefited from that, and it benefited from the SOE reforms. Everyone in the Wairarapa actually benefited from those reforms, and I thank you for asking me, because normally people write books about the reforms and never actually ask us why we did it. Thank you.
Since it's all about you, it's fair that you got your stand up, but I thought, Liz, I know we were talking about the impact, and I guess there's 2 things, isn't there? There's economic impact and there's social impact. Liz, I know we talked the other day about some of the impacts on Featherston and what a dramatic change it brought to the community. So, do you want to talk us through that and how different Featherston is today, and Bob as well?
Thanks, Tracy, and a very good morning. Oh. And Richard, that was pretty interesting. I mean, there's no question there were some gains, some positive gains, but there was some major costs. And I'm going to touch on some of those costs and a wee bit about the gains. Richard talked about the meat industry. In '89, we lost nearly 900 workers when the Wairarapa freezing works was closed. It was a tremendous blow. But just looking back at that time, we'd just come off a peak of about 63 million sheep being farmed in this country. Just by the way, it's 23 now, 23 million. But there was no question we had an overcapacity of freezing work space in this country. We had an old plant, was built in 1910, and it's done its dash really. So there was a major cost though to the region, losing 900 jobs overnight. They paid a small redundancy, but most of those workers then, at a time of high unemployment, really struggled to find work. And one of the positive things from the reforms was the sale of some of the Crown assets. And as you recall, the forest at Namu was sold and picked up by the Japanese company Jukin Nisho. And in the 4th of February 1992, Jim Bolger opened the new plant that employed close to 400 people. So that was a real positive, and that plant continues today. Though, going back to some of the social problems of the time, high unemployment, we had gang problems, we had limited support from Wellington from a policing point of view. Our police units through the valley were under-resourced. I remember we got Peter Tapsell as the Minister of Police through at one stage. He was unhelpful, never had too much idea. I just acknowledged Wyatt Creech, who came in before, who was enormous support to us through that long period. But we started to see some major social problems. The new plant, the new Dugan plant was opened in, as I said, February 1992. Later that year, we had a major homicide, the Wairarapa slaying of 7 members of the family. During that period, we had 4 other murders, one here in Featherston, involving Carol Burrows, and that was had a tremendous negative impact on the region. We had gangs pushing back on some pressure from the police. The Featherston police station was set on fire, and we had a constable's house in Marston, Dennis Bartlett, whose house was firebombed. So we started to look then at some action from a community-led action to combat some of these major problems. We were getting limited support from the government, but one of the things we did do, we started to bring all the state agencies together and our major community organisations and started to look at some remedies ourselves. And in time, with some really strong policing, we're going to change when Jerry Caneen became the Hutt Valley head of police, which picked up our region, and we started to see some better action, stronger action, and a turnaround in some of the social problems. But I just want to say it was a major negative through that period.
I was just going to ask Liz about that, because I know we've talked about Featherston and how it was impacted in terms of just, not small things, but the number of banks, the number of schools, Yeah, it was a major change, wasn't it?
Yes, Tracy, it was. And so just talking about Featherston just for a minute, the impact here was absolutely dramatic. Why? We lost a cheese factory that was just out at South Featherston that was world class. We lost the Wairarapa electricity, of course. That was one of the other things that changed dramatically. So all our lines crews, our retail shops in the Wairarapa got everything. We all lost our jobs, and that was that. That was 1995. And on top of that, not only was there a murder in Masterton and a murder in Featherston, there was also one in Martinborough, and that was more than one person. You remember that? Yeah. In the vineyards. What also changed dramatically with the closure of the freezing works in particular was the fact that farming changed, and it changed from beef and lamb to grapes, particularly, and that meant that we lost transport companies, we lost sharing gangs, and the price of housing changed as well. So if we look at Martinborough today, it isn't the Martinborough those of us of Wairarapa grew up with. And particularly for Māori, because they mostly worked in the freezing works and in the cheese factory and as tanker drivers and all of those things, they suddenly went to the only job available was in the vineyards at a wage rate that couldn't maintain a family. And so they left. And it was dramatic. In Featherston, we have the rubber factory just down the road. In there were almost 400 people employed, and they worked 364 days of the year, 24 hours a day. And what happened that made it the perfect storm, of course, was technology. That rubber factory still exists, but it doesn't employ 400 people anymore. It only employs half a dozen, maybe 10. But, so what you had coming down the line, amalgamation of the 3 towns, the loss, the dramatic change, and many workers lived here that worked for the railways, and suddenly they were on unemployment. The change in the farming industry in places like Martinborough, which went from sheep and beef to grapes, and the technology that was coming down the line at the rate of knots. And so it was dramatic, the impact here. We had 4 banks in Featherston, and of course nowhere now do we have a bank where you can walk in and get cash or anything. It's a machine and that's it. So dramatically changed. So we lost a heck of a lot, and we went into, a lack of confidence, a real decline. And the importance of talking today, Tracy, is the dream of Booktown that Lincoln Gould, the Biggses and Kate and Ross sat down one day over a cup of tea, probably wine actually, but, and determined that they were going to do something. And so the very big key was books. And we've now got 8 bookshops and other shops that are also selling books within this community.
I'm just going to ask Marilyn Waring, because you were on the other side, you weren't in Parliament after 84 for obvious reasons. It was a fairly tumultuous time for you personally, but you were in that cabinet beforehand. And I guess the question we all have to ask is, these were all dramatic impacts, but would they have happened anyway, given the state of the economy and given just how bad things were, as Richard Prebble has already outlined? Are these things that were inevitable, not just about Rogernomics? I mean, what's your view on that? You were there when the National Cabinet was sort of like hurtling towards an economic crisis.
I thought it would be a good idea just to remind people of the really chronic inactivity of the Minister of Finance in that 75 to 84 period. And just to kind of take you back to remember what the incoming Labor government inherited, quite apart from there being no money in the piggy bank at all. So farm subsidies led to increasingly serious distortions in farm investment and production, and this had become a major budgetary problem. Estimates varied as to the total cost, but they were thought to be around $400 million annually. There were 83 different farm subsidies and incentive schemes in place, in addition to the large interest rate subsidies from the Rural Bank. They tended to be allocated on an ad hoc basis, in part reflecting the political clout of each component group of farmers. Products with below average or low profits tended to receive more subsidies than products earning above average or high profits. A situation my colleague Ian McLean had called an admirable social welfare distribution policy. Ian's analysis showed an emphasis on increasing stock numbers rather than increased production per stock unit. And as Richard explained, we never had 70 million sheep in New Zealand. We had a livestock incentive scheme that encouraged you to see 70 million sheep in New Zealand. The subsidy regime encouraged spending instead of economising, and this led to wasteful use of fertiliser. Interest rate subsidies played a significant role in accelerating the rise in rural land prices. In my electorate, I had people engaged in capital gains as opposed to production farming. I'll just remind you about the taxation situation. The proportion of income tax paid by companies was 10% of total income tax revenue. The proportion of all revenue paid by individual taxpayers had risen to 89% whole. Companies paid a flat rate of 45%. Individuals are subject to a highly progressive scale, with a marginal rate of 60% on assessable income over $22,000. On my parliamentary salary and allowances with no other income, this was my rate. And inside the National Party caucus, there were a group who, particularly after the election in 1978, was a group that came in, I would say Ian McLean was the best of them all, but younger, and they were far more wanting to adhere to what appeared to be National Party economic policy. So I'll just give you this. This is a very typical caucus discussion. There was a proposed post office courier service. Don McKinnon called it an intrusion into private enterprise. Derek Quigley said it was out of line with our philosophy, and he was surprised the proposal hadn't been withdrawn immediately. Mike Minode said it was time to limit, not expand, state agencies, and we should be in orderly retreat. Doug Kidd agreed and said he'd be happy to defend a government decision to cancel the proposal, especially when private enterprise was capable of handling this service. Muldoon growled, "We do many socialist things in this caucus. It's a practical problem. We could sell Air New Zealand and Telecom, but we don't. This issue will be in front of us in a number of areas. There is an element of cross-subsidisation in many things government does. This applies to postal services and telephone rates. The larger electorates are being subsidised in these services by the bigger cities." So this went on for 6 years.
Yeah.
On and on and on, this standoff. And Muldoon always put, I was going to say, the most incompetent and yes or no sir people in cabinet, and the people who wanted to argue never got a look in anywhere at all. One of the other really crazy things here was the high cost of farming was because of the range of protection over. It was phenomenal. Over everything from baling ropes and twine, to rubber gumboots, to God knows, everything was being protected. And so that, we can't forget that it was, that in 84, the new government inherited a crisis, not just in overseas funds, in every single category of the economy was a nightmare. Just one quick little story, because we had the first Minister of Railways to look after things here. Okay, so I had my constituency of Raglan and Waipa. It included a place called Ngāti Ruanui. And you might remember that there were limits on how far goods could be carried on trucks, because otherwise they would interfere with the railways. So I had an egg farmer in Ngāti Ruanui who was really happy that he won the contract for the victual supplies at the Auckland port, until he found out he was 15 kilometres beyond the limit, and they expected him to put the eggs on the train every day.
I'm going to ask Rick Barker. Rick Barker, you were sort of like in the Labour Party, wider Labour Party. You were Deputy Vice President or Vice President of the Labour Party at that time, turning up to caucuses. During that period, it did sort of somewhat in the end tear Labour apart. What was the feeling within the grassroots of the party? You had people sort of writing graffiti, Roger Douglas loves Maggie Thatcher. There were comparisons being made with the Thatcher government. And obviously for people like you coming from the union movement, that would have been pretty tough.
Yes, thank you, Tracy. There's two things, really. Firstly, I think politics is a little bit like the law. Justice not only has to be done, it has to be seen to be done. So there is a process issue here. You can't just be right. You need to take people with you, and I think that was one of the failings of the way in which Rogernomics was implemented. It was seen to be, most people, it was a complete surprise. The Labour Party's manifesto in '84 was delightfully vague as far as the ministers were concerned. Nothing written down there, because there had been a deep political divide within the Labour Party at the time on the policy. Couldn't write it. So we in the party naively believed that the government would come back to us and sort of discuss economic policy with us, but it did not. We found out what their economic policy was by listening to Morning Report at 7 o'clock every morning, and away it went. And it was like being in a blizzard. And we got introduced to this new person. I'd never seen this person on the political landscape before, called Tina. There is no alternative. And this kind of caused a terrible rupture. Just one example is the Labour Party in Hastings had, prior to 84 and earlier that, had a party membership of well over 1,000 members. By the time Labour went out of government, it was down to 200. People left with their feet. Now, Richard is partly right on this, that you can come to a thing and you can have the answer there, but this is politics, this is a democracy, and you have to take people with you. This is a representative function. And what you heard from Richard today was a governor. And he was there to make decisions, and, what the hell with that? It's just the right decision. But it caused a rupture in New Zealand, and in my view, it broke a trust between the people and the government. And it was compounded later with the following Bolger government. So when it got to a challenge with about the electoral system, I don't think voters voted because they had been unfair to the Social Democrats or the Greens or the voting system. They voted because the two major parties, with the mother of all budgets, Rogernomics, etc., said a pox on both your houses. They're sick of it. And it was justified in a lot of ways. Just to pick up on two points from Richard. Yes, railways was overstaffed. And we had this long and glorious history of, starting in the 30s, with the first Labor government, of, in times of high unemployment, inflating the staff numbers in government agencies to take people off the street, give them a job. And you saw people sweeping stations who would probably not have got a job otherwise, but they had a job and they had pride and had pay and they went about their lives. So this was building social cohesion. In 1960s, Muldoon closed the Dobson coal mine. I was about to go underground and become a coal miner. This is the only thing Muldoon ever did for me was good. I couldn't go underground. I was third to the top of the list to be on the thing. And so I had to go and find something else to do. But Muldoon did two things. He made some miners redundant, but he gave them money to go on to education courses and try other things. And a number of the men then were shifted to the Runanga mines, and the mines were overstaffed. They all knew they were overstaffed. And I remember saying to the Minister for Mines at the time, I was familiar with this, that be careful here. If you go and talk to the miners themselves and say it's overstaffed, they'll acknowledge that. If you tell them what you need down here for a minimum number of men to get, they'll tell you. And you will have to then say to them, how can we manage you in the transition to somewhere else? They know this. They're proud people. But no, we didn't do that. Went there and it was chop, hack. And then we had ministers of the Crown coming along saying, oh, we're now getting this amount of coal with this much more fewer miners. What it did to those miners who were made redundant was make them feel like sponges. They'd attack their personal pride, whatever, as if they were freeloaders. Well, it was part of the social contract. They were given a job too easily. I thought we lost people here all over the place. So my biggest criticism of Rogernomics is that in the way in which it was implemented, it broke the trust between the people, a large section of the people, and the government. We had an alternative process going on in Australia, and Australia managed to keep people together, keep the union structures together, work out social contracts like the superannuation scheme, etc., etc. And we all knew it had to be reformed. And it's a little bit like Goldilocks and the three bears and the porridge. We all need porridge. You can have too hot, cold, or warm. Australia went for the warm stuff, the Goldilocks. We went for the super hot and ripped through things at an unbelievable rate.
I'm just going to ask Richard Prebble about that business of taking people with you, because of course Labor did win the 1987 election. So to a certain extent, do you think that's because people acknowledged the need, or and then it all fell apart after that, obviously. But do you think if you'd gone slower, if you had been more measured in your approach, that things might have been different, that you would have actually done more than you did? Or was that not possible? Did you do about as much as is possible?
Well, when you don't have any money, going slow is not an option. So, you couldn't put off the devaluation. And when you're in a situation where the New Zealand taxpayer was actually subsidising the Iranians to fight a war, that's not sustainable either, and it ought to stop. But let me make this point. I admit I have made more New Zealanders redundant than any other politician in history, and I hope no politician ever has to do that again. But here's a fact that people still have difficulty accepting. I never got a single letter from a person, the thousands of people that I made redundant, complaining. Not one. I had a huge stack of letters from people complaining that they hadn't been made redundant. And they were saying, why are those useless so-and-sos able to take redundancy and I'm a wage slave? I had a standard letter that I would send back and say, you're not a wage slave. You can, in fact, leave. We would regret if you go. The reason we're not giving you redundancy is we actually need you because we need a certain number of railway drivers to run the trains. I made my son-in-law redundant not once, but twice. I admit he wasn't happy about it, but it did enable him to move house from Mangere to Onehunga. And then he came to see me a few years later and said, I've been last night at the post office redundancy convention that we have every year of all the people made redundant. And he said, we had a great evening, and then we sat down and had a chat. And we all agreed that actually, personally, redundancy was the best thing that had ever happened to us. Some of us bought another house like I had, paid off my mortgage. Other people had set up business. And he said we actually had millionaires in the room who would never be millionaires working for the post office. And then they all agreed that the post office was miles better. People forget, people say it's great having overstaffed post office. The post office postage rates every year went up faster than inflation. When we reformed the post office, we actually reduced the price of stamps by 20%. People sent more letters, and we had a profitable post office, the only one in the world. And they said, the post office is better. And then he said to me, some people said, well, should we invite Prebble to the next reunion? And then they all agreed, no, he's still a bastard.
One of the things, obviously, if you look at that, though, the railways hasn't been a great success. It's back in government ownership. Air New Zealand has had its ups and downs. Do you think, are there any things you admit that maybe you got wrong?
Probably. They don't come to mind. About 85% of the reforms that I made, if they're so terrible, are still in place today. Successive Labor and national governments can attack Rogernomics, but they actually carry on with my reforms. And I tell you that the 15% that isn't being followed should be. And one of the things people miss out from the Rogernomics reforms, the crucial one was we introduced competition. You see, there used to be no competition. The only place you get a telephone was from the post office, and you had to wait 6 months to get a telephone. You had Air New Zealand, in fact you can see them doing here again, Air New Zealand cost of fares were the highest in the world because they had a monopoly. Well, I introduced...
pretty high again.
I introduced competition and said, and if I was the minister again, I'd introduce competition again. It's competition that actually made the reforms, not the people that I appointed. There was the fact that when there was competition, there was choice, people had to improve the services. So if you're asking me what do I regret? I regret that I wasn't able to ensure that competition would continue, that you couldn't have future governments doing brainless things like they've done with the railways and the rail ferries, etc., but I won't go there.
Okay. Actually, I was going to... Maybe you should. What's the solution to the rail ferries? Sell it, obviously.
I never sold a single asset. I just sold liabilities.
I'm going to ask everyone for a roundup very soon, but so we've got time for questions. But one of the things I do want to ask you is there are still some, we're seeing now some very sort of structural problems with the economy still. Were there things you should have done that you didn't?
I think it's pretty hard to blame structural problems that are happening now on what happened 40 years ago. And indeed, some of the things that have been mentioned here happened well after Rogernomics. Yes, we have got technological change. New Zealand has sort of been held back like a Polish shipyard from any technological change, so when it hit hard. But for a government to try to stand up against the market, to say we're not going to have artificial intelligence and the like, that's nuts. Of course it's going to happen. And the things that I actually regret is what we weren't able to do. The Labour Party caucus and our friend Rick Barker, they were prepared to let me run the businesses, but they wouldn't let me go anywhere near education and health and social welfare. And
Thank
those
God.
three... See? And those three areas need reform. People say, what's the problem with unemployment? Half of the children who are leaving school are leaving functionally illiterate. That's an absolute disgrace. And it's gone on under Labour and national governments, and we shouldn't tolerate it for a minute. And if I'd been given a chance, I wouldn't have.
Okay, very quickly before our questions, I'm just going to ask, Marilyn, looks like you've got something to say, just a quick roundup.
Yeah, it's very quick, because I just want to give you another reason why railways needed reforming. The Railways Union advised me that they did not wish to employ females on manual jobs because women undertaking heavy tasks would cause embarrassment to customers when handling luggage. Women couldn't work on night train services because of the risk of family strife caused by men and women employees working in close association in conditions conducive to misconduct. The ability of women staff to cope as bartenders or bar managers on trains was also open to question. There were no women in locomotive crews. Locomotives had to wait for long periods, and rostering a woman at night with men would jeopardise the reputation of staff.
Liz.
Can I just add to that, and they probably weren't going to be paid as much.
Very good.
So, Tracy, just one final comment. I accept that the gains have been significant, and I could see that through the process. But I just want to say, in my community, through that period, every day I observed the social consequences of some of those policies, of high unemployment, major social problems, people desperate to feed their family and also get into the workforce. And just an example, I came back, I used to get the figures from the Ministry of Social Development every week on our numbers of unemployed. I came back after a short Christmas break, looked at the figures, and we were desperate. I wrote to every employer in the region and said, would you please consider taking on one extra employee? And we got a really good response, but that's how desperate we were starting to get. So there were consequences, and it was bloody hard.
Yeah, and and some of those indicators you talked about, Richard, around were stemming from things like generational unemployment, weren't they? Do you sort of see that as being one of the consequences?
I've got to make some more confessions. When the unemployment rose, the Cabinet turned to me and said, you've got to find a solution. So I chaired a Cabinet Committee on Employment, and we studied who was unemployed. Very interesting. I picked Wanganui, where I'd closed the railway workshop, 300 people. Only 22 of them had gone on to unemployment. I think they had a displacement effect. So people further down the line with less qualifications couldn't get a job. We then analysed who was unemployed, and interestingly, the the civil servants said we should just give out assistance to Māori, because we know a lot of Māori are unemployed. But we actually analysed who was unemployed, and the driver was actually whether you had any educational qualifications. And those who had left school with nothing, they made the long-term unemployment. So we set up the Access Training Scheme, and we said to the people running it, you've got 6 months in order to train someone with an employment skill. The Education Department said, we'll do that. We said, no, you've failed. We're going to let anyone. And then we said to the people who are running it, your success rate will be on how many people get employed. There were some schemes where 100% of the people who went on the Access scheme got a job. There were some others where no one did, they got fired. The Access scheme was extremely successful and carried on under the next national government until the Education Department managed to get control of it again and completely destroyed the scheme in only 6 months. But I say that to you right now, education is still the answer. The unemployment figures, when you go and analyse them, I guarantee it's made up of the long term of predominantly people who have got no educational skills. And what I mean by no is they are functionally illiterate and enumerate. It's an absolute disgrace. We're spending a fortune, and half of the people leaving school are functionally functionally illiterate and enumerate, and that's not my statistic, that's what the Education Department admits.
Rick, very quickly, and then we'll go to questions.
I think for me, one of the biggest consequences of the deregulated economy, and I don't blame this entirely on Rogernomics, but it has gone on. No, not entirely. I do. Can I just have a little aside? Someone did write to you, Richard. And I saw the letter, and it was when you were saving rail. The Secretary of the National Union of Railwomen wrote you a letter on the letterhead, and he had this new fancy thing called a photocopier. So he put his letterhead in and put his hand on the machine like that, the cover over it, photocopied it, and then put his name on the bottom and signed it and sent it to you. I thought it was the most magnificent letter I've ever seen.
I did too. I thought it was the Churchill symbol.
But and I think they never wrote to you because they thought you'd never going to listen. Anyway, the thing that's for me the worst is I come from a background of being a union official for what I regarded as some of the poorest paid, the hardest working, and the best people of all. I always felt that I was on the side of angels. People who are cleaners, cooks, kitchen hands, porters, orderlies, all of those people. They did all the heavy grafting. When the lights are on in Wellington at midnight at night, it sees people from Pororoa and everything out there slogging their guts out to make some extra coin for their family. These are the best of people. And I've seen their living conditions trashed over the years. When Labor introduced GST, it changed the tax system. And I remember having a meeting with Roger Douglas, and we pointed out to him that the cleaners in motels were working 2 hours a day. Their actual tax, direct tax, went up. They were stunned. We got the pay sheets, got all this worked out, and to their credit, they changed it. Their income tax went to being neutral. But this was one group whose tax cut never came, and everything they bought, they had to pay 10% GST on. See, GST is a regressive tax. The less you earn, the more you're going to spend, the more tax you pay. But it has been a massive transfer of wealth in New Zealand, and no one speaks about it. The poor have got poorer, and I know people say that as a slogan, but it's true. I give you all this evidence you have that the disparate income is getting bigger. Labor never went to full hog on market deregulation, but they started there. And then when National came along, National said, well, they started that, we'll do the job properly, and they did. And now we have a huge part of the workforce on the minimum wage, which hardly moves at all. And other areas, chief executives and other, their pays have gone up faster than a Chinese skyrocket. The poor, working poor in New Zealand are better off in some ways because they can get cheaper this and that for the imports, but for me, they don't have enough money for the basics. I see too many people who can't feed the kids properly. I see too many people whose teeth are rotting out of their head because they can't afford to go to a dentist. And I think we've got this growing problem in New Zealand. And even Jim Bolger said that the labour market reforms that they implemented under his government went too far. And I think we've just got to accept that we've got a diverging society here in New Zealand, and if it continues on this trajectory, it's going to become, divisions in New Zealand are going to become so great, it's going to make it difficult for social cohesion.
Thanks,
and as a
Greg.
consequence, I don't think we're going to get a political consensus here until we can agree that this is a problem that needs to be addressed.
Thanks, Greg. Right, we do have a few minutes for questions, and I see some hands up already.
This seminar was about Rogernomics, but Roger Douglas has been mentioned only once in passing. What is his role in all this?
Central. He's the main architect. He had the ideas and then got me to implement them.
Yeah. I think you were the bother boy, is that right? Yeah. Yeah.
That's true.
Marilyn, he's still okay, isn't he?
Could talk about how the privatisation of railways has led to such problems for the Wairarapa, but I'm more interested in following up Rick Barker's comments about growing inequality and what your recipe would be for not the chief executives, who do at least pay some tax, but for taxing income on capital gains or wealth.
People forget that Muldoon introduced a property speculation tax in the 1983 budget. So we have had one before, and that was another. The National Party hierarchy was sitting in the gallery and none of them had a clue it was coming. So when people go on about whether or not there should be a wealth tax or a property speculation tax and talk as if we've never had one, we did, and it happened under a national government. We have to now have one or the other. There's no way. I get intolerant of governments talking about not having the resources to do A, B or C, or having to rob women of billions that they have a right to, and refusing to change the taxation system.
In fairness to Roger Douglas, he's actually always been in favour of an asset tax. But he doesn't want an asset tax and income tax. Then he'd be absolutely crushed. And income tax is actually in some ways very unfair, as Rick Barker has pointed out, because everyone's earning an income, no matter how poor they are, have to pay it. And the other advantage of an asset tax is it's actually very easy to implement because everyone knows how much assets you've got. And in Taiwan, where they did it, you just declare your assets, and the government's got the right to buy those assets at the price you declare, and every year... And every year they pick 10 people. So people tend to be honest, but there we are. It's not going to happen, but...
Yes, I have a question for the panel. We've been talking about, my name's Graham, we've been talking about the financial impact of things. One of the social measures that concerns me is that, you know, prior to this Rogernomic era, we have an incarceration rate in prison, which is relatively low and fairly respectable by given world standards. Now we have got one of the highest incarceration rates in the countries that we measure ourselves against. And the majority of that is coming from a growing lower socio-economic society within our society. Is this a concern for the panel and the consequences of because this all started with, this climb in incarceration started with the beginning of Rogernomics.
Oh, well, I've got no redeeming features. I used to be a lawyer and I acted in the criminal court, and we've actually always had a higher incarceration rate than we than say Australia. So it didn't start with Rogernomics. It is too high. Prison is a total failure. But there are certain individuals, frankly, it's up to me, they'd never come out. But there's a whole lot of other people who should never be there, and we ought to be looking at alternatives. Governments keep saying they're going to, but it was another area where the Labor Party caucus never let me have a go at.
He would have sold the prisons.
Oh, there's quite a lot of quite sensible measures that people actually go to jail in New Zealand, not because they're in the subclass, but because they can't afford a driver's licence. Then they get fines for driver's licence. They can't pay them. We have automatic fines, which the bureaucracy thinks great. For me, that's just the price of going the speed I like to go. Yeah. And for other people, it's total bankruptcy. They couldn't possibly pay. They end up in front of the courts, and then they go to jail. Over half, the last time I looked, of people who went to jail, they actually started off on traffic offences. It's a load of nonsense.
I'll just come back to the person's point about the incarceration rate. You're quite right. We have to have a re-look at our criminal justice system and how much we want to beat up on people. I think that the rate of incarceration is too high. But a side issue, if we don't get a head around the drug issue, we're going to keep going the direction we're going. The simple point is the war on drugs has been a failure for 100 years. Never going to work. The drug dealers in the States voted for criminalisation of drugs. Why? Because it meant that the price of drugs went up. Now, in Portugal, they have decriminalised drugs, made it a health issue, and the state sells all of the drugs. Just cut the gangs out completely. Because people are going to get it whether you want it or not, and by the state providing it, it's better quality, fairer price, etc., etc. Crime rates went down. The addiction rates went down. And if someone needed to have some drugs, well, you need some help as well. And the interesting thing is the research shows that people who get addicted to drugs, it's because of a mental issue themselves, a trauma and so on. We should be helping them. And I've got a nephew of mine who has a conviction, spent a lot of time in jail in Australia for drugs. And he had a terrible upbringing which had traumatised him. And it's always been in the depth of me, he said, "Uncle, when I do drugs, it's the only time I find peace." And because he resorted to illegal drugs to find peace, we have now made him a criminal with a criminal record and almost impossible to get a job. This is a guy who deserves our sympathy, not a beating. I'm just outraged that we just cannot get a head around a sensible policy on this.
I think we've got... Oh, okay. Sorry, there was one woman there who's on the start. Okay. Very quick.
Because we're out of time. Oh, Mr. Prebble, you do have at least one redeeming factor. Every time I get on an Air New Zealand flight, I think it's raining. I think, thank you, Mr. Prebble, for the overbridges. But anyway, no, let me finish. You've had your talk.
I can tell you a story about it if you like.
No, tell me later.
We definitely don't have time for stories.
Anyway, thank you for the framework that you did give. I knew New Zealand was on its knees from some of my business friends at the time you were talking about. But anyway, I think some of the changes that are made then are probably... The outcomes of them are a long way down the track. Now, you talked about individuals doing well, and I suppose the most famous would be Graham Hart, who bought... It's now the billionaires list. But at the other end of the scale is the public good, and I I have to say, I don't believe the electricity reforms have worked. I cannot see in a country of the 5 million, same size as Melbourne, how you can have a really competitive industry. We had an extremely...
I think we're going to have to stop here.
How do we correct this? You talk about competition and more competition, but how is
I think
it
we
going to
might
work?
have to leave that one up in the air because I know I'm being hounded about the fact that there's another session happening. Thank you all very much for coming. I really enjoyed it. I hope you have too.